Hey everyone, welcome to today's lecture in Intro to Political Science. So today's focus will be on political parties. The reading was from the textbook, chapter 6. So hopefully you've already had the chance to do the reading. All right, so where do political parties come from? So political parties haven't always existed. It's something that would have been developed as legislatures were developed. So government hasn't always had a legislative branch, but as legislative branches gradually developed over the last centuries, political parties have also arisen. Um, Now, even before we had formal political parties, whenever there's a legislature or whenever you have a sufficiently large group that's making decisions, it's common for factions um, of individuals with similar interests to form or to join together. So that's even outside of politics, right? Like even if you have, or formal politics, whenever you have a group that's making decisions, so it could be in business, it could be in education, whatever it is, you're going to have certain alliances of those who have common purpose, who have shared interests forming together. But eventually, these factions became more and more formal and formed into political parties. So the origins would be within the British Parliament. Now, when the monarch used to be the one who picked the cabinet, but as the power to choose the cabinet switched from the monarch, so the king or queen, over to the legislative branch, then these factions formalized more formally into what we would refer to as political parties. They would have looked different from the political parties that we see today, but we would have seen kind of a greater need to have organized political parties. Um, these political parties developed a central role in the competition for political power in legislative bodies and in governing. So they play an important role in kind of in how we vote, in how we run legislative bodies, but also in the policies that are created. So in how governance actually works. If you want to understand um, uh, the kind of the legislative side of governing and also the electoral side of governing, understanding how political parties operate um, is a necessary feature. In many countries, political parties are extremely strong and play an important role. So there's different types of political parties. So many of the initial political parties could be referred to as cadre parties or cadre parties. So a loosely organized party usually established by members of the legislative body with support of local notables. So in this case, there'd be less ties back to the direct electorate. It'd be more a kind of a loose party that's organized within the members of the legislative body, but without necessarily a formal mass party outside of the legislative body. So it organizes behavior within the legislature, but not necessarily as much outside of it. And they would gain their support from local notables, so often elites at the more local level from uh, outside of parliament would be the ones who would be providing the political party the funding that was necessary. So they didn't have to go back to the average person for funding. There were certain wealthier, usually individuals, who could also help generate support for members of the party, who would give kind of the financial and marketing background to those parties. This meant also in terms of how the political party had to represent kind of voters, it was less beholden to kind of the wider electorate and was more beholden in terms of policies to the preferences of those local notables, those who they relied on for elections for success. And so that those are the people who they had um, uh, to kind of placate or satisfy. Eventually, there was more of a shift towards mass political parties. So that's a party that draws its support from a regular dues-paying membership. So these are formal political parties where many people can join and much broader membership. So for example, in Canada, you can join any of the political parties. You could join, the Liberal Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, the New Democratic Party, the Bloc Québécois, the Green Party. You could join and become a member. There's usually fees which go towards helping to run the party, so the administration of the party, but also running in elections. And beyond the dues, many members of the party will also make contributions. You don't necessarily have to be a member of the party always to make a contribution, so you can be an independent. Also, not all of the people who vote for the party will necessarily be party members. You'll have independents, or sometimes people will cross party lines. But rather than focusing on gaining money from a small number of people, here the mass parties are trying to get as many different members of the citizenry, from the very wealthy down to the much less wealthy, to be members of the political party, to support the political party, to be active in campaigning for it, or contributing to it, or helping to participate in policy discussions, ultimately for sure to vote for it, and sometimes contribute financially to the political party. So the central differences between these two different forms of parties. So mass parties feature strong centralized party organization outside the legislature. So because you aren't just organizing the kind of the voting within the legislature, but also this mass movement of campaigning, of finance, of thousands of members outside of the legislature within just the regular public, you need a centralized party structure, a party organization, to be able to deal with this. So heads of party, administrators for the party, managers for the party. They tend to be more disciplined in terms of how they vote within the legislature, and tend to have stronger link between the citizen and the leader. So whereas when you're in a situation where you're getting most of your funding and most of your advertising from certain notables, all you have to really do is satisfy their desires. When you're based on a much wider dues-paying membership, and you require broader, support, a larger number of people for your financing and for organizing your voting, then the political party and the leaders of the political party have to be much more responsive to the desires of the average voter, particularly those voters who are members of the political party. So a larger number of people are involved in the political process, and whose desires need to be satisfied through the political process. There are multiple forms of contemporary political parties. So most political parties, contemporary political parties, particularly in the Western world, would fit the electoral professional party. So electoral in that there's involved in voting, but also professional party in that in the central party organization, there's many professionals whose job it is to help the political party win. So its main focus, rather than being purely ideological, is actually really in winning the election. And so it relies on the experts to help them market themselves to the electorate. So that's not to say they have no ideological commitments, but in terms of which issues they're going to bring up, and rather how hardline or softline they are on particular issues, will depend on what their marketing experts and their political strategists tell them is necessary for winning this election. So the stance of the political party will largely be responsive to polls, to research, to focus groups, in terms of the important issues. Most political parties, like I said, in the world, so if we look south of the border, the Republican and Democratic parties both would fit electoral professional parties. There's many elements, to be honest, of electoral professional party for the Canadian parties as well, but typically Canadian parties are referred to instead as brokerage party, and that's a party that attempts to find compromises to accommodate a variety of interests in order to build broad support. And so this is often, brokerage parties you're more likely to see in larger countries with kind of different regional needs. So to a certain extent, again, Canada and the US would have elements in the political parties of electoral, professional, and brokerage party. Most European ones would fit electoral, professional party, and to a large extent, the Canadian ones would fit the brokerage party. So if you think about a political party in Canada that's trying to win, so if you have to satisfy many, many different needs if you want to have, be able to be winning an election, right? So you've got, you have to take into consideration the concerns, say, of Atlantic Canada, whatever those considerations might be. Those considerations may be different than those in Quebec. In Quebec, you're always having to deal to at least a certain extent with ethno-linguistic issues. There are certain elections where ethno-linguistic considerations are more or less important, but they're never absent, right? Then in Ontario, they have slightly different considerations than in Quebec and the Maritimes. Western Canada, so the prairies in Alberta, through Alberta, will have different considerations, different issues, particularly some of them will have issues with Western alienation. That's particularly strong often in Alberta. And then BC will have elements of kind of Western alienation, but also different interests based on some of the cities that are there. And so the issues that are important in different regions of Canada are often different. And so if you run on just one platform that doesn't take kind of different regional interests into account, you may be successful in Ontario, but get shut out in the other regions of the country and not have a successful election. And so political parties in Canada have to often walk this tightrope in terms of putting together a platform that has a little bit of something for everyone. So sometimes it also could be sometimes ideologically consistent in that you're dealing with very different concerns. And not all of them will necessarily always kind of fit in with a consistent ideology. It's very complicated in many ways. Putting forth, you have to give enough to everyone, but you also have to make sure that those things that you give to one region isn't something that's going to lose you another region. So you can't give something to Quebec, make a promise to Quebec that's going to lose you Alberta and BC. You can't give a province to Alberta and BC that's going to lose you the Maritimes. So it's putting together kind of this coalition, this disparate, diverse platform to try to build as broad a support that's necessary. Then you've got programmatic parties. So that's a party that has a distinct ideological perspective or a coherent set of policy goals. So oftentimes either very distinct in terms of where it falls on the ideological perspective, and it's not going to budge from that regardless of if that means losing seats in other regions of the country. Or sometimes it may be that there's a particular issue that's important. So the Reform Party had a particular ideology and a particular set of policy goals. The Reform Party eventually became a part of the Conservative Party, merged with the old Progressive Conservative Party to form the Conservative Party that we have now. But the Reform Party was based in Western Canada and had very conservative values, very conservative ideology, but also a goal of representing Western Canada. Green Party has less of an ideological perspective, so it's less committed to necessarily a particular ideology, but has a very clear set of policy goals when it comes to environmental issues. On non-environmental issues, the Green Party can be ideologically actually quite diverse, with some members who actually can be rather conservative, many members being more aligned on other issues with Liberals or NDP. The commonality with those members is that, with Green Party members, is that on the most pressing issue for many of the Green Party members would be the environment. So regardless of what their other commitments, ideological commitments would be, they would find that the other parties aren't putting forward a strong enough agenda on the environment, and so they've joined the Green Party. On most other issues, so typically, ideologically, there'd be a greater overlap with Liberal and NDP, but some members would sometimes, you could find, have even more conservative viewpoints than others. And then personalistic party. So this is a party that's dominated by a powerful leader combined with a weak party organization. This is much less common in Western democracies. I suppose you could make an argument that the Trump Republican Party, I mean, there's still a strong party organization, although to a certain extent, this strong party organization has almost lost control of the party, and it's kind of following to a large extent whatever Donald Trump and his base desires, at least over the last 4 years, has done so. So you can make an argument that while still more of the electoral professional party, that there's some elements of a personalistic party. So it's where whatever the leader says is the party's dominated, and the success of the party is dominated by the personality of that powerful leader. So we'll look quickly at the major political parties in Canada. So the and what's interesting with the two oldest, the Liberals and the Conservatives, is you'll see that actually over time there's been a profound or somewhat of a change in their policy orientations. So the Liberal Party in its early years overlapped when we talked about a liberal ideological perspective. So a classic liberalism favoring free trade and limited government, as well as provincial rights, and rather than a dominant central government. So regional rights, small government as possible, government steps in only to solve whatever problems are absolutely necessary that the market can't handle, and open to free trade. Individual freedom, provincial freedom, economic openness, free markets. So your classic liberal perspective. As with the early Conservative Party, it moderated its ideological perspective to gain support. So eventually, over time, it gradually moved more and more towards the center, adopting a softer ideological perspective. The problem with having extreme ideological perspectives is that it turns off a lot of people. So many political parties move towards the center to help gain in broad support. In particular, it became associated with national unity and the development of the welfare state in the 1940s. So moving from a classical liberalism to more of a kind of reform or larger government focused, still elements of liberalism, and to, in many ways, a social democratic party. So interesting if we look at kind of its origins. Yes, still supportive of free trade, some elements of support from unions, so there'll be some element of protection for labor and protection of certain important industries to Canada, but generally still open to free trade. But and not a huge government party, but also not a limited government party. So certainly a robust set of social services, of social programs, of economic programs would be supported under a liberal agenda. So certainly you would not say the Liberal Party is the limited government party anymore. And rather than provincial rights, you would certainly supportive of provincial rights, but also more of probably a central government. So less of a provincial rights party compared to some of the other parties that you would have. So you definitely have a movement towards the center. So we would put kind of the early Liberal Party in the, not necessarily in the center left. Now we would put, if we had to put kind of an ideological left-right perspective, we'd now put the Liberal Party on what we put as the center left. The Conservative Party is the oldest political party in Canada, and it's a party that was based on a coalition of factions. Remember, often parties originate with factions that existed in legislatures that support the Union of British North America colonies in 1867. So those who favored the formation of Canada as a country, as opposed to a colony. The party was traditionally associated with tariff protection for manufacturing industries in a strong central government. So if you are aware of the Conservative Party platform nowadays, the Conservative Party would typically now be viewed with being opposed to tariff protection, and certainly not a strong central government. So more of an ideological perspective in limited government, so more individual freedom, more economic openness, free market openness, but also much often more supportive of provincial rights as well. To a large extent, support for provincial rights comes from a large amount of Western Canadian support and a perception that the federal government is dominated by the center of the country, so Quebec, Ontario. So a desire for provincial rights, so that the more things are controlled by the provinces, the less the Quebec-Ontario factions could control policies in Western Canada. The newer version of the Conservative Party general favors, like I said, smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation of business, free trade, increased provincial government autonomy, and mandatory minimum sentences for criminal offenses. So quite ideologically, so both socially and often, so certainly economically conservative and often socially conservative as well. So in this case, if we view there's a moving right? So if we've talked about a strong central government and tariff protections for manufacturing, that's more of a centrist, if not slightly left of center kind of perspective early on. And now we would have the Conservative Party as our center right to right wing party, depending. The progressive conservatives who came before the Conservative Party would have been a center-right party. The Reform Party, who's now also part of the Conservative Party, would have been more of a right-wing party, and the merger of the two is center-right to right, depending who's in charge, really. Some of the policies would fit quite happily right near the center, and many of the policies would fit more with the kind of more just solidly right, not necessarily centrist. The New Democratic Party, formed in 1961 with roots in the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was established by delegates from various farmer, labor, and socialist groups during the Great Depression. So the roots here are more in kind of socialist groups, but also labor and farmer groups who overlap often in viewpoint with socialist groups, in terms of a solid agenda of welfare state measures, greater social and economic equality, and stronger environmental regulations. So the NDP is really born out of a desire, it's the answer to the rise of socialism. Here's Canada's answer to the rise of socialism. So the closest that we have to a socialist party, a real socialist party in Canada. Rather than, so when we talked about socialist, one of the categories was kind of social democratic. This would be a clear social democratic party. To the left, so if we said the Liberals were center left, the New Democrats would be left. There'll be some overlap, right? Because one is center left and one's left. There'll be some overlap, some areas of agreement between the New Democrats and Liberals, but some areas where the New Democrats would argue the Liberals don't go far enough, or the Liberals would say the New Democrats go too far. So the Liberals are kind of in the middle between, so the Liberals would have some areas of agreement with the New Democrats and would have some areas of agreement with the Conservatives. And then some areas where the others go either too far left or too far right. The Bloc Québécois favors Quebec independence and contests seats only in Quebec, so only runs candidates in Quebec, the ultimate goal being Quebec independence. But even outside of Quebec independence, the Bloc will always be voting on Quebec interests. So even if it's the issues not related to most issues that come up in Parliament won't have anything to do with Quebec separation. But the Bloc Québécois viewpoint will always be what is best for Quebec. It'll always favor greater provincial rights. Greater provincial rights gives greater autonomy to the Quebec government, which is in line with the Bloc Québécois agenda. It tends to favor social democratic policies and stronger environmental measures. So outside of the Quebec independence agenda, most members of the Bloc Québécois are typically quite social democratic. So some overlap often with the NDP or the Liberals, and stronger environmental measures with overlap often with the New Democrats a little bit, maybe the Liberals and the Green Party, who we'll talk about. The Bloc Québécois has actually had considerable success despite only running in Quebec. They were the second or third largest party in Parliament for 7 elections between 1993 and 2011. Their first became the second largest party for the first time in 1993, so which was a huge deal. First, it was the first time that the official opposition, so you always have kind of the largest party is the governing party, and then the second largest party is the official opposition. This was the first time that the official opposition was not the Liberal Party or Conservative Party. So that was certainly a big deal, but also that the second largest party was a regional party, so only running seats in one province, but also a party whose stated goal was Quebec separation, right? Quebec seceding from Canada was the Bloc agenda, and that would have been in 1993. In the lead up to the referendum, would have been a particularly strong time of Quebec separation being important in the Bloc Québécois agenda. So that also was a particularly striking result. You can imagine that there would have been some concern among non-Québécois to having the official opposition be a regional party whose stated goal is the kind of disintegration to a certain extent of Canada. The extent that Bloc Québécois places on independence will vary with the time. In the Quebec electorate, there's always strong support for Quebec nationalism, but for Quebec independence, the level of support will vary. Support for Bloc Québécois will typically vary to a large extent with that support, but also the importance that the Bloc places on independence, how central it is in their party platform, will also depend on the appetite for within Canada for separation. After a string of almost 20 years of really good success, the Bloc Québécois actually had a disastrous election and actually lost official party status, winning only 4 seats in the NDP Orange Wave in Quebec, where the NDP largely outside of certain areas largely swept Quebec seats. But in the last election, after a couple of poor elections, the Bloc Québécois actually had a surprisingly strong election. It was an election actually that caught a lot of people off guard, how well the Bloc Québécois did. So we'll see. It was a party that was almost pretty close to, if it had one more bad election, that may have almost been close to written off for dead, that even people who supported Quebec separation were putting their vote to a different party, either the NDP or the Liberals, commonly in the Quebec City region, sometimes the Conservatives. And the Bloc Québécois was kind of losing their electoral support. But with a more successful election, we'll see what happens. Then the Green Party, so focuses on environmental issues, but has developed positions on human rights, healthcare, electoral system reform, and foreign policy. Often on many of these other issues, large overlaps with the Liberal Party, some overlap with the NDP as well. the Green Party would certainly be a party that favors electoral system reform, with the way the voting is set up with, and we talked about already before in Canada, the country's divided up into ridings or electoral districts, and whatever candidate in the district gets the largest share of the vote wins the seat. So for example, if you had 3 parties running and 2 parties in each of the seats got 33% and 1 party in every single seat got 34%, that party, despite getting 34% of the electorate, would win 100% of seats. Of all political parties, this system hurts the Green Party the most. Because they're typically the smallest party, they could get 10, 11% of the vote, potentially in an election, but get 1, or 2 elected members of parliament, which is far less than the 10% of seats that far less than the 10 or percent of seats. So the single, what referred to as single member plurality system harms the Green Party arguably more than any other political party in Canada. It typically favors the Liberals and Conservatives the most and hurts the smaller parties the most. Elizabeth May became the first elected Green Party member in 2011. There's been multiple elections where there's been talk, will this be the time the Green Party, as there's more and more, as polls show more people interested in the Green Party, as environmental concerns continue rising, there's always kind of at the start of each electoral campaign, is this the time the Green Party is going to make a breakthrough and get more seats? And each time, generally speaking, the Green Party in seats underperforms. In large part, that's probably, again, because of the electoral system. Even people who are interested in voting Green may defect, thinking that in their region, the Green Party has no chance of winning, so they might as well go for their second favorite party, Liberal or NDP often, who have a chance of winning. So some people won't vote Green thinking it's a wasted vote, and so will end up defecting. So Green Party in terms of performance will often underwhelm based on polling or underperform compared to polling. Other political parties, so kind of in Canada, will be largely at the regional level. So many of the political parties in Canada, the federal parties, will have regional arms. So a federal Liberal Party and a provincial Liberal Party. Provincial Conservative parties have de-linked from the corresponding Conservative Party. So Conservative parties that exist at the provincial level are not linked in any way to the federal Conservative Party. Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, and Quebec have independent provincial parties as well. So ones that have no corresponding federal party. So for example, in Quebec, you'd have, among others, the Parti Québécois, Coalition Avenir Québec, Québec Solidaire, among others, a large number of parties that you'll often see on ballots in Quebec. These parties have no equivalent at the federal level, so they're provincial parties only. That's actually not the case in most provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, and Quebec being the kind of the exceptions to the rule. Now, how many parties are there often are there in a given country? And that's actually going to vary across different democracies, and it can have an impact on the stance of parties on elections. So a party system refers to the basic patterns of relationships among political parties. So first look at kind of how they develop. Lipset and Rocan argued that the party systems of Western countries developed in response to 2 major historical turning points: development of modern nation state, that makes sense, require a nation state for political parties, but also kind of the modern apparatus of mass voting, and the Industrial Revolution, so the greater level of organization that came with the Industrial Revolution. Most recently, post-materialist values, which we've already talked about in a previous lecture, new parties. So in Canada, in the last decades, we've seen a rise in the number of political parties. So up until 1961, with there only being two, and you had the addition of the New Democrats, essentially the Bloc Québécois, the Green Party, and the link between social group membership and voting has left some to argue that Western political systems, party systems, are changing. So they are representing different interests. So having to take into account new values that are emerging. Also, to a large extent, in many democracies, seeing kind of a decline somewhat in strength of political parties, where fewer and fewer people are joining political parties and are kind of independent and vote according to whichever political party in a given election most meets their needs. So it could be that they're a moderate and want to see which of the political parties that are in the center is at that time going to have the best candidate or the best platform at that particular time. It could be that they always vote the same party, but just aren't so attached to the party that they really want to be involved in paying dues or registering or being self-identified with that party and kind of participating in that party process. And so they sit as independent. In the US right now, actually, I believe it's now actually reached 50% of the American electorate is now independent, which is an enormous number. Not only, and then 50% will be split between the Democrat and Republican Party, and the percentage is continually growing for independent. In terms of fundraising for parties, this poses more difficulty in terms of kind of having an established understanding of what you need to win, right? You're wooing independents who can go back and forth between the different political parties. It makes the process more difficult. Typically, you'll assume there are variations. There are times where where there are exceptions, but typically you're going to assume that most people who are registered in your political party are going to vote for your political party. So if you know that 40% of the electorate is registered for your party, you know that your baseline in an election, if everybody turns up, is about 40% of the vote. If your party only, so say one party has 40%, another party has 40%, and then you're fighting over 20% of the electorate. If one party has 25% and another party has 25%, and you're fighting over 50%, creates a lot more uncertainty in the election. Many party systems do feature at least some degree of ideological competition. So oftentimes different parties will have ideological stances. Sometimes there will be on particular goals, so they'll be less ideological, but most political parties you could kind of put down somewhere on the ideological kind of, if you do kind of like a left-right continuum, you could put most of the political parties down somewhere on the left-right continuum. So, you could put in the US, the Democratic Party on the center-left side and put the Republican Party on the center-right, although drifting further right. You could put, in Canada, the Conservative Party on the center right to right side, the Liberals on the center left, the New Democrats on the left, Bloc and Green Party being a little bit more difficult, although you could put the Bloc usually on the center left to left, and the Green Party often on most other issues on the center left to left as well. So you still, most of them, you can largely assign kind of an expectation of where they'll come down on ideologically. Many countries outside North America feature competition between social democratic parties on the left and conservative or Christian democratic parties on the right. So parties that their ideological stance. Many researchers argue that parties tend to become less ideological over time and drift to the center of the ideological perspective to develop broader appeal, right? So political parties often can do one of two things. They can race to the extreme and try to really mobilize the base at the extreme, but you risk losing the middle. Most voters are typically in the middle on the ideological spectrum. You'll have some out at the far left, you'll have some out at the far right, but most are more concentrated in the middle. So oftentimes there's an argument that you'll see a race towards the middle. Political parties will continue moving towards the middle because they want to capture, that's where the greatest density of the votes are located. And so you want to make sure that you're not losing that portion of the electorate. So for example, what would happen if one party moves to, say, the extreme left, and it's say in a two-party system, one moves to the extreme left and the other stays in the center, or center to center right. Well, the center right party is going to capture most of the center. It'll even probably capture many of those on the center left, leaving the left party to capture only the left and some of the center left. That's likely usually not to be a winning formula. What's interesting, and many traditional Republican Party advocates are actually concerned that the Democratic Party right now is, particularly on Biden's leadership, is quite center. Center left to just pure center. The Trump faction of the Republican Party has to many extents run to the extreme right, particularly on social issues. So there's a concern of many traditional Republicans, many of your kind of your center right Republicans, that this could have very severe electoral consequences, that in many districts, in many what we refer to as purple districts, so districts that could go either direction. There's some districts in any country, particularly in the States, where you know which side it's going to go. It's either always going to be a Democrat or always Republican. We refer to as purple districts, those that could go either way. The fear would be that if the Republican Party stays at the far right, that they'll give up they'll lose all purple seats, all purple districts. They'll lose to the Democrats because they just would no longer be competitive in those regions. So that is something, if you're following electoral politics in the U.S., as some have put it, the fight over the soul of the Republican Party, how that comes down could have extreme consequences for electoral outcomes in the coming years, particularly in the midterm election in 2 years. Now, the influx of refugees from Muslim countries has generally increased support for radical far-right populist parties, and just to increase in immigration from non-European based countries, non-European countries, has in much of the Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, has supported increase for far-right populist parties. So in Europe, often more fringe parties, but those fringe parties who have existed for a long time have gained in support. The Republican Party in the US has been largely co-opted by a more right-wing populist agenda. So even in the US, kind of see a rise in that form of political party. Here are party ideologies in select Western countries. Those in bold are leading parties in most recent elections. So those that have had kind of the most success recently. Parties with less than 3% of the vote in the most recent election are excluded. So many of these countries, there'd be more parties, but if they don't get at least 3%. And then there's a sum in parentheses is kind of their ideological perspective. Liberal and conservative, no ideological perspective attached, because, well, their name kind of makes it a little bit obvious. And then NDP, Social Democratic, Bloc Québécois, Quebec Nationalist, Green, no real ideology. The States, Republican being a conservative party, Democrats being a liberal party. UK, conservative, obvious. Labour, Social Democratic. Liberal Democrats, Liberal, and then Scottish National. And you can go through if you're interested in the different parties. And in some of them, you can see there are far-right parties. In France, you got the National Front or Front National, which would be more of a far-right party. Let's see, Spain, does Germany? Yeah, so AFD, populist right, which would be a further right party, but also in some of them like Germany or Sweden, where you've got many different parties. For example, Germany has a radical left party also. So you're going to have in Europe where you have proportional representation. So the amount of seats you get depends on the percentage of vote you get. Typically, then you have more political parties. And so if you look, the US has only 2. Canada's got 5, but 3 prominent parties, or not prominent/national parties. And so, and then in many of the European ones, though, you see many, many more parties. So your US and Canada being single member plurality, or sometimes referred to as first past the post, so whoever gets the most votes in the district, typically have fewer political parties, and those that have a proportional representation system, and as like most of the continental Europeans, will typically have larger numbers of political parties. So turning to the number of parties, 2-party systems. It's a party system in which 2 major parties can tend to control the government. The US is the prime example that you would think of as a 2-party system. They're competitive in that a single party does not govern for a lengthy period of time. So if you look at electoral history in the US, typically you see, with a few examples of a party that only does 4 years, or sometimes you'll have a party that will do 12 years. But oftentimes, if you look at it, you'll have 8 years of one party, and then 8 years of another party, then 8 years of one party, then 8 years of another party. So if we look, for example, you had 8 years of Bill Clinton, then a Democrat. Then you had 8 years of George W. Bush, a Republican. Then you had 8 years of Barack Obama, a Democrat. Then 4 years of Trump, so a Republican, and then back to Democrat. Before that, though, you had before Bill Clinton, you had 12 years of Republican, but before that was a Democrat, and before that was a Republican. Before that was Democrat. Before that was actually Republican, and so it is a lot of back and forth between them, and that's fairly normal with a 2-party setup, where one's going to kind of respond to whatever the other one has done, and you'll have an energized base on whoever's the losing side. That energized base is really going to want to be turning up. The party that has lost is going to adjust its agenda to try to win back support. So it's normal in that type of system that you're going to go back and forth. In multi-party systems, party system featuring several parties that are significant actors in the competition for political power. There's actually a lot of variance, so within multi-party systems into kind of the structure, right? So you can have what are called 2+ parties system, or sometimes 2.5 party systems. So a 2+ party system would be Canada for a good number of years. So pre kind of 1993, where you had the 2 major parties, so the Liberal and Conservative. You had, say, starting in 1961, you had the New Democrats, but the New Democrats weren't a substantial. They existed. They ran in many districts across Canada, but they weren't at best, they sort of spoiler, kind of stealing some votes from other parties, and which could tip certain districts, but they weren't gonna, major contenders for winning election, weren't even really contenders generally for the official opposition um, position. So it was kind of a two-party system, largely two main contenders with a third party kind of involved. Third, or it could also be fourth or fifth parties involved with several secondary level parties. Then you could have a moderate multi-party, still often dominated by two parties, which is the case in Canada. So still, all prime minister has still always come from Liberal or Conservative, but the other parties have grown in importance. NDP um, and Bloc have both had substantial elections where they've um, had, major shares uh, of the seats in Parliament. The Bloc has had official opposition status. There's some elections actually going in where the NDP were viewed as potential candidates to actually win. It's never come to fruition, but they've certainly come in with major expectations into many of the more recent elections. So while still dominated by the Liberal Conservatives, the other parties now take a much more significant share of the vote and of the seats in Parliament, giving them a greater influence in politics in Canada. And then fragmented multi-party system would be one where you've got, say, 5 plus often major parties. So you'd have trouble kind of identifying the say two major ones, or if there are two major ones, they would get a much smaller share of the vote. And so it's really a fragmented one where the share of the vote is evenly split, or largely evenly split across multiple political parties. So it would be hard to say that you've got your dominant one. And so the consequences in terms of policy, in terms of stability of government, in some cases of frequency of election, in terms of swing in who's governing, will be affected by whether you're a two-party system, a two-party plus system, a moderate multi-party system, or fragmented multi-party system. Then you do have much less common, but you do have one-party dominant system. So it's still a democracy in that there is a free vote, but it's a single party that will rule for long periods, and the opposition party is unlikely to be able to challenge the dominant party for control of the government. So, for example, in Alberta, for a long time, before the NDP managed to win, for a long time it was almost a foregone conclusion that the Conservative Party in provincial elections was going to win in Alberta, right? It was dominated by the Conservative Party. The NDP did eventually win, but for a long time, that was kind of more or less a foregone conclusion. Certain countries, South Africa has had long periods of time where one party it dominates. This can be a concern. So in many cases where of one-party dominant system, it's not a case that there's any level of fraud going on. So it's not to say that these opposition parties aren't given the chance to win because there's voter suppression or anything like that. So it is purely democratic. There are some scholars and members of the public who are concerned by one-party dominant system, in that if one party is always in control, is it the case that you're really having a chance, to, if you lose, to have your views heard, but also kind of just a monopoly in terms of like, how responsive does the party really have to be to public concerns? There are other one-party dominant systems where there'll be, there's a reason that one party stays in power, and that's because of significant fraud or voter fraud or opposition to, jailed opposition members. So a country like Russia, where the same political party has been, Putin's party has been in power for a very long time, And though many of the measures put in place, I mean, his party will change regulations in terms of how long a leader can serve. There'll be many members of the opposition may be arrested, or there'll be limitations on their ability to organize. So while there is an election, it's not necessarily a free and fair election. So that would be certainly the much more concerning version of a one-party dominant system. How do we select and remove the party leader? So in terms of selecting the leader, parties use different methods to choose a leader. So it could be selection by the parliamentary party. So those who are elected to parliament get to choose who among those who are elected to the parliament get to lead them. Advantage being that you're more likely to have those in parliament voting in line with the leader if it's a leader who they chose, right? They're likely to choose somebody who they can get behind, and they know they can get behind. The weakness is that it's less democratic, or at least less involvement of the citizenry, right? Yes, each member of the public gets to vote for selecting their member of parliament, but they have very little say in the party leadership. Most common would be selection at party conventions. So members of the party will have will often be able to, so members of parliament and members of the party leadership will be able to participate in the convention. Oftentimes, different regions will be able to elect delegates who go to the convention. And so members of the convention then get those who are elected to represent the region get to vote at the convention to select the leader. And then finally, there's direct membership vote. So in this case, it'd be everyone who's a member of the political party would get say a ballot, and they all get to vote on who they believe the leader should be. Party conventions is usually the most frequent selection method. Removing a leader could be highly contentious and can have different mechanisms. So there could be a lot of internal pressure to resign, particularly members of the parliament could, stop voting along with the leader until that person resigns. So that could put intense pressure on them. It also similarly, there could be external pressure from the electorate for the party leader to resign. Essentially, if the electorate shows that it has no confidence in the leader. Legislation passed in 2014 in Canada allows a party's caucus to decide if they want to conduct leadership review after a general election. So those who are members of the party in Parliament, we'll return to a caucus in a second, after a general election, they can choose to have a review. So say your party did particularly poorly in the election. The members of the caucus, so those who are part of that party in Parliament, can decide that they'd like to have a leadership review and potentially a leadership contest based on those results. In Australia, the parliamentary caucus of a party can vote to oust their leader at any time, so not just after a general election, at any point if they lose support. Other than that, without some mechanism after an election or at any time to oust the leader, other than putting pressure on them, in many times it requires a resignation. Once the person is selected as the leader, it will require the resignation of the leader for them to give up their power. How are candidates selected? So most advanced democracies involve the local or regional party organizer in the selection process and allow the party leader to veto the choice of candidate. So oftentimes it'll be local or regional party organizers. So, members of a particular people within a particular region or district will choose who their party candidate will be in that particular region. So, in the Ville-Marie region, members of the party organization in the Ville-Marie electoral district will choose choose who will represent the Liberal or Conservative or NDP leader at in that particular district. Oftentimes, so the national party leadership has some level of veto over the candidate. So they may not be able to say exactly who the candidate will be. They may not be able to choose the candidate themselves, but they may be able to veto a particular candidate saying that this one is not acceptable for a variety of different reasons. It could be electability, it could be party stance, so it could be kind of positions that are just antithetical to the overall position. In Canada, party members usually vote to appoint a candidate, so within a particular area. But the Liberal Party does give the leader the right to appoint potential candidates. So more than just vetoing, in the Liberal Party, the leader is actually also able to choose candidates in a particular region. Could be for a variety of different reasons. It could be someone who is the party leader hopes will take on a cabinet position. So a high-profile candidate who's hopeful for a particular cabinet dossier, the leader might choose to put them in a friendly riding. So it may not even be the district that they live in, but it's one that traditionally votes Liberal. And so they're going to put the star candidate into that safe district to make sure that they get elected. Primary elections allow citizens to select candidates for the party prior to the general election. So that's what we have in the US, where there's a primary election. So for example, we saw recently the Democratic primaries, where there's a large number of people who are running for leadership of the Democratic Party. And then in each different state, you had primaries, you had votes where in some cases, members of the party, in some cases, the general electorate could vote to choose the candidate, and then the leader is chosen based on the results of those primary elections. So it's a series of elections that go forth in order to select the candidate. The laws of a considerable amount of countries require that parties nominate a certain proportion of women as candidates. So increasing numbers of countries do have gender quotas, saying that a minimum number of the candidates must be women. It could be up as some of the countries' gender quotas will be as high as 50%, where 50% of the candidates must be women. That doesn't say in terms of success. So that's not saying 50% of elected representatives will be women. It could depend on the successfulness. So it could be, if women overperform men, it could be much larger than 50%. If women underperform compared to men, it could be fewer than 50%. But at least of those who are candidates who are running, some will have quotas. The reason being for this is sometimes, even among some feminists, it could be a debated issue, but the rationale is typically that women have historically been massively underrepresented in politics in general, and particularly in leadership positions. So the idea is to, until we're at a point where women are just as likely to be able to have their voices heard in politics, until we reach that point, we need to use law to give women opportunities to have their voices heard. Hopefully, obviously, the hope of this law is where you can get to a point where the law is no longer needed, that women and men will have equal likelihood of being able to be selected for any level of political office, that there's no advantage or disadvantage based on gender. But until we get to that point where there is no advantage or disadvantage based on gender, these laws are there to help with representation. And representation is important for many reasons. It's important in terms of the issues that come up. It's important in terms of, it's psychologically and emotionally, it's important for everyone to feel like they have equal access into the system. It's important for policy reasons. If men and women support different policies or for representing different issues, there's certain issues that male leaders just may not think of as important because they're not issues that typically affect men as well. Yes, they can legislate on them, but it's more likely that you're going to have the issues become an electoral priority if you have a strong number of women who can discuss the issue, push the issue, and put strong policies in place. Canada has no laws surrounding gender quotas. Those parties have tried to nominate more female candidates. The NDP has traditionally been best on gender representation. Typically, the further left on the ideological spectrum in Canada, the better in terms of nomination of female candidates. Trudeau, in terms of designating his cabinet, has made many pledges in terms of increasing gender representation. Party policy. So in some parties, there's a vigorous debate over policy resolutions at party conventions, providing an opportunity for those active party members to be involved. So if you're a member of a political party, you can generally participate in different conventions that the party will hold. Not only one for selecting the leaders, but they'll also hold at different times in the year what are called policy conventions, where members of the party will meet to discuss different policy issues and vote on what the stance of the party should be. And so this could be an important place for members of the public who have just signed up for a political party, paid the dues, to have their voice heard, an additional avenue for them to have their voices heard. That said, which is great in terms of for democratic ideals, we do have to be cautious. So party leaders and key party officials often exercise a considerable degree of control over the process of discussing and adopting resolutions at party conventions. So either in terms of sometimes ignoring the resolutions that will be adopted at party conventions, but also in terms of setting the process, setting the rules for adopting resolutions or discussing resolutions, and putting in place a policy or process or a discussion process or a voting process that will ensure that resolutions that they don't want to come up or issues they don't want to come up won't come up, and that their preferred, on issues that do come up, their preferred stance will be adopted. So by controlling the process, it does give them a large amount of leverage. Party caucuses and party government. So a party caucus, like we talked about, is a closed door meeting of the party's parliamentary members. So it's all those who are members of parliament who are also members of a particular party make up that party's caucus. So all MPs who were voted as members of the Liberal Party would sit in the Liberal caucus. All those who were elected as part of the NDP party will sit as part of the party caucus. Now, there are some times where someone was elected as a Liberal MP, but will change sides and sit with the Conservative caucus or with the New Democrat caucus or whatnot. Some may get elected, say, as a Conservative and sit as an independent, so not caucus with anyone. Those can happen. But all those who are members of Parliament, who at that time are members of a particular political party, will be part of that that caucus, and a part of that will include participating in meetings where policy discussions and strategy discussions take place. There's a strong expectation that each party's members of parliament will support the position that the party caucus has decided to take. So whatever decision the caucus has decided to take through its caucus meetings, there's a general expectation that members of the caucus will vote, whether they supported it in the caucus or not, whether their preferred policy choice was reached in the caucus. The expectation typically is that they will vote with members of their caucus. It'll depend sometimes on the issue. There'll be some which will be designated, for example, as free votes, where regardless of what the party leadership or the caucus has decided, it's a free vote. So members of all parties can vote their conscience, whatever they desire. And then there'll be votes where there'll be considerable punishment if you defy the party. That's usually on closer votes or votes that are of considerable significance for the party, considerable importance for the party. In Canada, they're typically referred to as whipped votes, or in many parliaments as whipped votes, where there'll be a lot of pressure and you're expected to vote with the caucus. The Prime Minister and Cabinet are almost always members of a particular parliamentary party and rely on the support of their parliamentary party to maintain their positions and improve legislature, right? So the party in power will certainly expect that members of their caucus will support them in voting and often rely on it to stay in power. Because if you don't get sufficient, in many parliaments, if you don't get sufficient votes, you can lose the confidence of parliament, and there could lead to the fall of the government. So obviously the caucus, typically speaking, the party's caucus will want to stay in power, and so will vote with the prime minister and cabinet to make sure the government does not fall. Political parties do need to raise funds if finance their operations. So like we said, many political parties beyond, have kind of a professional organization to them, and so require financing to run the organization of the party. So the locations, the buildings that they control, pay salaries of employees, hire outside organizations to help, so say potentially polling firms, and conduct election campaigns. Election campaigns are extremely expensive. To allow for fair competition, many countries have established limits on election expenses, put restrictions on campaign advertising, provided public subsidies to parties and campaigns, and required public disclosure of donations. So this is to make sure on multiple fronts. To make sure, so required public disclosure of donations and limitations on donations. So make sure that no individual or group gives too much money. The fear if any per individual or group gives too much of donation, that their donations will be sufficiently important that the party will, that they'll essentially be able to capture the party. Threat of not giving donations in the future means that the political party has to follow whatever their interests are. And so it leads to a less democratic process where political parties can get captured by particularly large donors. So that's viewed as anti-democratic. Also putting often caps on election expenses in general. So how much can be spent in an election, many countries will have rules on to make sure that, if it's either political parties nationally or in particular races, putting caps to make sure that it's not just a wealthy person's game. When there's typically lower campaign finance laws or less restricted campaign finance laws, you typically see those running for office, there's almost a minimum wealth requirement to run for office. Because of just, yes, you require many donations, but also it requires considerable amount of your own funding as well. So kind of this desire to keep, or this fear that if spending runs rampant, it creates barriers to entry where some people just can't enter into the political process and potentially run for office. It also avoids smaller parties ever being able to enter the process because the larger parties with their larger donor base would just spend them into the ground. Many countries will provide public subsidies to parties and campaigns, so using public funds to give campaigns money for them to be able to run. Often this will also go hand in hand with private donation caps, or caps on donation. The goal here is to make sure that it's controlled how much is spent, and so to make a level playing field between different political parties. Often the amount of financing you'll get will be tied to your electoral outcomes. So larger political parties will have some element of advantage, but it does mean that smaller political parties still do have access to funding. Until 2004, there were no limits on contributions to political parties and candidates at the national level in Canada, but now there are significant there was significant campaign finance reform putting in place different measures. And Canadian parties are reimbursed for 50% of eligible campaign expenses from public funds. So again, making the goal here is to make sure that that the most number of people are able to participate in the electoral process. So there's fewer barriers to entry. So as long as you are able to get to major party status, so as long as you're able to get a sufficient percentage of the vote where you're viewed, where you're eligible for these campaign contributions, so for public funds, then it gives you, even if you have less private ability to raise funds compared to other parties, you still will have some share of money that's able to come in from the public sector or from public funding. All right, that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed learning more about political parties, and I'll talk to you next time.